I got to know James when we brought the Morgan to. We talked about bringing the Morgan to New Bedford, and I was lucky enough to be someone who reached out to other organizations and tried to get them involved in what we were doing. And when I talked to James at first, when I said to him that we had thought about we were going to try to sail the vessel, not just restore her and bring her to New Bedford, he treated my point with the disdain it deserved. He basically said, "Sure, buddy," or words to that effect, as I recall. So there was a credibility issue, but we kept talking, and by the time we got a little, I knew that we'd made the truce, or we were on the right track when James put a countdown clock in the lobby of the New Bedford Whaling Museum, and it was 2 years before we were supposed to get there, and that thing ticked every day, and it was a great experience. I want to thank my lovely wife for coming along. You know, talk about being a glutton for punishment. But she's perhaps heard some of these things before, and if I get anything wrong, Martha, just let me know. You know, we get along with help from our friends, and she's been my best friend and an anchor to windward for many, many different voyages. So I appreciate her hanging around still, as a matter of fact. It proves, among other things, she has a sense of humor. I had the great luck of the accident of birth, you know. I was born here on the island. As Mark Twain said, you can only take so much credit for that. He said he was born in Missouri so he could be with his mother at the time of the event. And I think that's probably how it really works. But it's really fun for me to come back and be here and see the Hillmans in the front row. I mean, those are great friends and such great historians, and have been remarkable in carrying the story on and presenting it to people and collecting things. So for me to come here, come home in a way, to do this, is really a terrific experience. And I'm going to show you a lot of good pictures. My goal here is to do two things. One, give you a very brief history, and I mean a consolidated history of the Morgan. But really, I want to share with you an insider's view of the restoration and then the 38th voyage. And so I'm going to show you a lot of slides. And then there's a short, it's about an 8-minute video which chronicles us sailing. One of the things I like to say as I went around the country talking about this project was that as we were doing this, there was no one alive that had sailed on a whale ship. There were no color photographs of a whale ship under sail. The Morgan alone remains. She's the last of her kind. And so that we were trying to imagine how we could bring her to life. And that's what we did in this project. If I push the right button here. So one of the things we did was we talked to people who could help us think about why this was important. And David McCullough is a remarkably elegant and eloquent person. And as you can see, this is what he said. And what I wanted to build on is the fact that she represents powerfully represents a rousing chapter in our nation's history. This is the point I think that's so meaningful to me. He said, if you don't know your own story, you don't have a soul. It's a kind of amnesia that's just as damaging to a nation as it is to a family. The Morgan is an emblematic of a vastly larger story, and her restoration will enable Mystic Seaport to continue telling this story for years in the future. And what is meaningful to me about that is that it really, I want to just say a few things about my dad, because here he is. And he was the head of this organization three different times. He then was hired to go to Mystic Seaport and was the chief curator, was the head of Mystic Seaport for 13 years. And I, as a little kid, in the old building, there's a whaleboat like this. I'm a little guy, and my dad, my twin brother, and I would come here, and Dad would be showing people around. He'd be up in the bow of the whaleboat with a harpoon, this leg in the clumsy cleat, you know, saying, and this is how they stood here, and this is what they did. And we just thought, Chris and I just thought, you know, everybody could go into a museum and touch things, et cetera, et cetera. And then when Dad got the job at Mystic in 1953, we moved there. We were 7 years old. I say we, I just mean my whole family, but particularly my twin brother and I. You know, we moved to a house on the grounds of the museum, and that's where we lived. And so I say to people always, I say, look, the reason I'm as weird as I am is that, first of all, I'm the product of centuries of inbreeding on Nantucket. And then I was raised in the 19th century at the Mystic Seaport Museum. So it's a miracle I haven't been hit by a car. But we didn't have any idea. We were clueless, and we thought everybody lived on the grounds of a museum and got to be in the midst of all of these amazing places. And I remember the most dramatic thing for us. We didn't care about the museum. We didn't care about anything. We hadn't ever been. Chris and I had never been off island, and we moved to Mystic. There were trains there. We had heard about trains, but we'd never seen one. And hearing those whistles as the train, the main line from Boston, from Washington, New York, was right through Mystic. And so that's the thing that we remembered the most. But Dad, the thing about this quote that David McCullough has is that the reason Dad got involved in history was because he was curious about his own story and our family and what they had done in terms of whaling. And so he started out as a reporter for the Inquirer Mirror, and he wrote, he did that and eventually became a managing editor. And when he came back to Nantucket, he was the editor for a while before he got back involved with this organization. But he started to read logbooks and to find out about his own family. When he was a young guy, my grandfather was a fisherman and had a shanty down on North Wharf here. And Dad said that when maybe he was 10, he heard, my dad was born in 1903. He heard that there were some old-timers there who were whalemen. And so one day some of them were sitting, they're probably my age, by the way, old-timers. But anyway, they were sitting in the lee of one of the shanties there, and Dad screwed up his courage and went over to one of them, and he said, "Excuse me, sir," he said, "is it true that you were a whaleman?" And the guy looked at him and said, "Sure, it's true," he said, "and whose brat are you?" And so that was the introduction to the sensitivity of whalemen telling their own stories. But Dad started to read logbooks, collected logbooks, and eventually got a Guggenheim Fellowship to do more research. And in the early 50s, he wrote a book called The Sea Hunters. And that was published, and it's really, in its time, was the definitive history of whaling, or the first part of whaling anyway. When Mystic saw that book, that's why they hired him to come to Mystic. The New York Times review of the book said everything that Melville wasn't able to cram into Moby Dick about whaling, Stackpole has crammed into The Sea Hunters. And so that was his magic carpet, if you will. And it was really because he was trying to find out about his family and our ancestors, and what he became was a communicator of that whole bigger story to the country and the world, really. So let me quickly jump to a short description of this is the overview, the Cliff Notes. This is the history of whaling. Okay, over 200 years of American whaling, and of course Nantucket was in the forefront of that. Led the whole thing. During that 200 plus years, there were 2,700, just over 2,700 whale ships that pursued whales. They sailed on 14,864 documented U.S. voyages. This comes from Judy Lund's book, and Judy wrote a book called Whaling Masters and Whaling Voyages Sailing from American Ports, and it came out in the early 2000s. And I used this number, came right out of her book. She actually wrote something in the recent historic Nantucket, and she told me, she said, of course we found more now. So she said that actually there were more than 15,000 documented voyages. I keep adding on to them. In that period, the Morgan, which was built in 1841, sailed for 80 years. She sailed on 37 voyages around the world. And she actually sailed from the beginning, she sailed during the most profitable, successful decade of whaling under sail, the 1840s. She sailed literally to 1921, which was the end of whaling. So that was her passage as she transited her way. And here's a little bit an overview of her. This is a cousin's painting of her leaving. He spent that time as an active whaling vessel, 37 voyages. In 1925, she was saved by, and I'll tell you that story a little later, at Colonel Greene's. In 1941, she came to Mystic and has been there ever since. In 1966, she was declared a National Historic Landmark. She was the first merchant ship to get that designation. Dad actually made the application, and when it was approved, it was signed by the Secretary of the Interior, whose name was Stuart Udall. Some of you may, of a certain age, may remember him. But the first ship to be named a National Historic Landmark was a a vessel, a little vessel called the Constitution in Boston. And then the Constellation was the second one, the Morgan was the third one. And you'll see more about that later, too. This is a copy of a diary from Charles W. Morgan. And one of the things I want to point out as we go along here is when there are some Nantucket connections, and I'll tell you about his in a minute. But this is him. This is the diary that he wrote about the day that the Morgan was launched. And he was a Quaker from Philadelphia. I'll tell you more about that in a second. But you can see what he had to say. My favorite part of this is when he talks about it being a great day and his elegant new ship being launched in the presence of about half the town and a great show of ladies. I mean, it just proves that Quakers did look around. He was a Quaker, and he was noticing who was in the audience. But he talked about how beautiful she looked, and she was copper-bottomed on the stocks, and she was going to be captained by Thomas Adams Norton, who is this guy right here. He was from Eggertown on Martha's Vineyard. He had sailed as captain of several other Morgan-owned vessels, and this was the brand new Queen of the Fleet, and he got to be the captain of her. And then this is Charles W. Morgan himself. Born in Philadelphia, moved to New Bedford in the early 1800s, 1813. He actually followed his two sisters and a brother who had moved there first from Philadelphia. He was an entrepreneur. His two sisters both married into the Rodman family. And so when he came to New Bedford, he met through them the sister, Sarah Rodman, of the two brothers that his sisters had married. And so, of course, there was nothing else to do but marry her. So who needed computer dating? I mean, this is how they got to know each other. And so Sarah Rodman. And Sarah Rodman was the granddaughter of William Roach from Nantucket. And so that's the connection right there. And as you know, there's, in terms of giants of whaling, the Roach family is right there at the top. It's remarkable what impact they had on the entire industry. And so as it became an industry that was the first that America dominated internationally, and it was an international industry. So that's Charles W. Morgan. This is from a journal that was kept on the Morgan's first voyage, and that was by a guy named James Osborne, and that's what he wrote as they left. And he pasted this painting in the front of the log, and I love it because it has nothing to do with whaling. It's if you look at it, it's some kind of a warship at some kind of a Mediterranean port. And all I could think of was he was trying to take his mind off his day job, so he thought about a different kind of a vessel that he might have sailed on. But here she goes. This is her first voyage. It lasted 3 years, 3 months, and 27 days. But who's counting, you know? It's the classic route. They went over to the Azores, came right down here, came around Cape Horn, and captured their first whale right here. Made their way up back and forth here, around here. And these are the spots where they captured the whales, killed the whales. And then they make their way up to the Bay of Alaska and catch more up there. These are baleen whales up here. These are all sperm whales. Then they come back down and eventually make their way home. In this 3 years, 3 months, and 27 days, they killed 70 whales. And so think how many days that is if you do the math. I can't do it. Martha could do it, but I can't do it. But it's a lot of days. And what people don't understand about whaling is that it was day after day after day of sheer boredom, punctuated by days and hours of sheer terror, whether it was in the hunt for the whale or in terrible storms. Making your way on a square-rigged ship around Cape Horn is no easy task, and that's what she did. So that was her first voyage. It was a very successful voyage. Captain Norton owned 1/8 of the ship. It was typical of captains to do that, and he did very well. In fact, he retired from whaling after that. He'd been at sea for 20 years before that, and went back to the Vineyard, and later his wife and he had a son, and they named him Thomas Morgan Norton, so he was appreciative of this vessel. The Morgan was called a lucky ship, and we'll see why they said that as we follow her story. Let me just go back here. See this spot right about here, like shaking hand, right about here. That's Isla de Cocos, which is this island right here. And it's now a World Heritage Site. It's a destination for people who are serious underwater divers, scuba divers, and fishermen. You can't stay on the island. It's a Costa Rican national park, but you can go there during the day. And back a little bit earlier, a couple in 2004 who were doing a circumnavigation on a yacht as crew stopped there, and they went ashore, and on the beach there were these rocks, and they saw this rock, and they had some things written on it, and so they thought they would see what it said. And what it really says, if you look carefully, is ship C.W. Morgan, July 14th, 1843. And on that whole beach, there are all these records of whale ships that stopped there, including James, by the way, the Howland, the famous Howland that brought the Japanese boy back. But it was interesting to me, they literally were there for 20 hours. They got water on the island and they left. And here's this place that people come from all over the world to visit. And the Morgan was there just to get some refreshment with new water, and then she carried on. In the 80 years that she sailed, these are the ports of call that she visited. And they're not, many of them she visited more than once. For example, she was in the Bay of Islands in New Zealand 15 times. And that's true of any of these ports that you want to see. But when we talk about the international scope of it, and of course the Nantucketers, in terms of where they had been and with their whaling experiences, and Nantucket was the leading port until about the 1830, 1840, and that's when New Bedford surpassed it in terms of number of vessels. And of course, the Roach family is the one who established New Bedford from Nantucket, because they had a deeper harbor, basically. So when we talk about it being international, it's so amazing. We think we're so cool today. And yet, you could have talked to someone walking down the street in Nantucket in 1825 or 1830, and they would have been able to tell you about the Pacific. They would be able to tell you about the Arctic. They could tell you about the Falkland Islands. They could tell you about Galapagos, and on and on and on, the different cultures that they'd seen. It was a remarkable story. When I talked about Dad doing research, one of the things that he did was he looked at the identification of these islands, the, quote, discovery of these islands. And in 1938, he testified for the State Department in support of the America's claim to some of these islands as being territories of the United States. That was a result of the logs of the whalemen. And that's an unintended consequence of those logs, was that was documentation of why this country could claim that they were part of their territory. Also unintended in those logbooks is the fact that they kept daily records of weather. And there are at least 3 different studies I know now that are looking back, because it's the only weather records. And they go back to the first whale ship came around Cape Horn just in the late 1700s. And so they've got weather reports from all over the world. And the other thing that they did was they kept charts, great charts. And those charts, just as we were leading into World War II, the Navy Department came to this museum, came to New Bedford, went to New London, went to San Francisco, and looked at the charts that the whalemen had, because at that point, those charts were still the best charts of the Pacific that existed. And I gave my talk at one point in Essex, Connecticut. When it was over, this gentleman came up to me and he said, I just wanted to tell you, he said, during World War II, I was the captain of a submarine. And he said, we did use those charts. Those were the charts we used. And then he looked at me and he smiled and he said, the only thing they didn't tell us was where the mines were. So there we go. And who was the crew? Well, the crew reflected where the vessel went, and it's no surprise that the majority of them came from this country. But look at the other places that were involved. And typically the Azores and Cape Verde are 2 of the places that the ships would go to get supplies, and they would get crew. And in fact, the last captain of the Morgan was from Cape Verde. But again, that's just an example of the international cruise. One of the things, if you read Melville in Moby Dick, and his description of New Bedford, when he came aboard, he went to sea on the Acushnet in 1841. He sailed from New Bedford about 6 months before the Morgan did on her first voyage, and went to the Pacific as she did. But his description is like, if you're familiar with the movie Star Wars, that bar at the end of the universe, New Bedford was filled with all these different people and ethnicities and cultures because they came on the whale ships, and that was what was happening. This is a cartoon from Vanity Fair that came out after oil was discovered in Pennsylvania, and it's a great celebration the whales are having to celebrate the discovery of oil Notice they have things like mineral oil, and oils well that ends well. This is my kind of humor. Can't resist it. But that was a transition time, and one of the things that was changing the industry, of course, was alternatives coming along, and it had an impact on Nantucket and New Bedford and San Francisco and other places. We're fast forwarding here. This is the Morgan and the Wanderer, the two last whale ships left in New Bedford. This photograph was taken in 1919. And remember, I said there were no color photographs of these vessels because color photography hadn't been invented. And this is really close to the end of the whole period. This highlights the whaling career of the Morgan in terms of what she did. There's one typo in here. It said she sailed from San Francisco, which she did from 1886 to 1906. She made 17 voyages. At that part, reflecting the change of going after whales that are baleen whales, partially driven by the fashion industry where the baleen was used to torture women by creating corsets that they were supposed to wear. But that was at the end of the whaling industry, the baleen was more valuable than the oil. And that was the last part of the industry. And again, she made 30 voyages, and her last one was in 1921. And this is an example of what her career represented. In terms of the value in the 19th century, a guy named Steve Purdy was one of the wonderful interpreters, like you have interpreters here too. They really make history come alive. And Steve did a lot of research, and he's an economist by training. And he translated the value of the cargo that the Morgan brought back into 21st century terms, and it was worth $32 million, almost 33. And the total number of barrels of whale oil, 54,483, and 152,934 pounds of bone. I'm going to just skip by this for a second. With any luck, this is a little video that I hope will show up here. Let's see. If we can make it. Here we go. You may have seen this. This is from a film called Down to the Sea in Ships, and I think actually it's involved in some of the films that are shown here. I show it because it was one of the things that the Morgan did after she finished whaling. This film was made in 1922, and both the Wanderer and the Morgan were in it. Actually, the sailing scenes were the Wanderer. I would love to tell you that they were the Morgan, but they're the Wanderer. And here's the fellow up in the hoops. Look at the scale there. His name is Raymond McGee. He was an actor. And he became very interested in whaling, ended up having a large scrimshaw collection. And when he passed away, he left that collection to Mystic Seaport. If James had known, he would have gotten it to New Bedford or here if he had a chance to. But interesting guy. This is just a little snippet from the film. It was about Charles W. Morgan, but it wasn't a history. See the goat? Watch the goat down on the bottom here. He doesn't care. Where's everybody going? What's going on here? And here they are launching the whaleboats. I don't know if anybody here has launched a boat, a skiff or a dinghy off of a vessel underway. These guys are lowering these whaleboats, and all I can tell you is when you do this, it's an opportunity for conspicuous humiliation because things happen. But here they go. They get released from the ship. This mast is in a hinge that's laying down there. The hinge comes up and allows them to put it's right there. You can see the hinge right on that whaleboat right there. And that made them able to put the mast in place while they were at sea underway, rolling around. And there's a pod of whales that they're after. We're not going to follow the entire, there is a Nantucket sleigh ride that's in this film. But here's the whale ship hove to and the whaleboat getting after them. Now they've tried out the whale and they've cut in and see that where he misses the guy's face with the sharp tool. It's really this part of it. It's not really a big deal. It's just a wooden boat filled with oil on fire in the middle of the ocean. I mean, what's there to worry about, right? And here she is sailing in some ways from the past to the future. This is coming right at the camera under full sail. And that film gave us something to remember. Well, let me go back to here. In 1924, at the end of June, this is another Nantucket connection, although it's not necessarily a positive one. What you see here is the steamer Sankaty that had caught fire in New Bedford, tied up to a wharf. The Morgan was laid up on the Fairhaven shore, and the Sankaty, blazing, burned her dock lines and drifted across the harbor and laid alongside of the Morgan. And at that point, the Fairhaven Fire Department came and saved her. If they hadn't come, and it was a really tough thing to put out, they were able to save her, and so she survived. That was July 30th in 1924. And then we don't want that anymore. And then in August 25th of 1924, less than 2 months later, the Wanderer left from New Bedford on what everybody thought was going to be the last whaling voyage out of New Bedford. And she anchored outside of New Bedford because they were still trying to get crew. While she was anchored with not a full crew aboard, this huge storm came up, a gale, and she dragged her anchor, broke one anchor chain, and dragged her other anchor all the way across Buzzards Bay and wrecked on Silent Pig's Reef off of the western end of Cuttyhunk Island, broke her back, and that was the end of the Wanderer. So at that point, the Morgan was the last of her kind. That was what made that happen. And within 2 months, the Morgan could have been gone too if it hadn't been for the fire department. She ends up laying along the shore in Fairhaven. There's efforts to try to raise money to rebuild her. Really a challenging time. They're not making much progress until in September of 1924, a gentleman named Edward Howland Robinson Greene stepped forward. And in addition to Edward, which is a nice name, but the other three names are really important. Greene, he was named because his mother was a woman named Hetty Greene. Does anybody know who Hetty Greene was? The wealthiest woman in America. She was, her maiden name was Howland, and so that's where that name came from. And she became an investor, and literally that's a whole story that's worth following. It's an amazing story. The Witch of Wall Street, they called her. And she lived in a miserly way her whole life and amassed the largest fortune at that point on Wall Street. Took on the boys in Wall Street and killed them, and was an eccentric, interesting character. Well, her son, Edward, when she died, she left her money to her daughter and her son. And they both became very, very wealthy at that point. And he heard about the Morgan. Some people approached him who were trying to save the boat. And they talked to him, and he said, well, I'm interested because my father, Edward Robinson, was the second owner of the Charles W. Morgan. And so the ship means something to me. She's the last one left. She represents an important part of American history. And so I'm going to step forward and save her. And so he did. He, year and a half, 2 years, he fixed her up. He hired a guy named George Fred Tilton, who was a famous whaleman, to be her ship keeper. And then on July 21st of 1926, he opened her to the public at his estate at Round Hill, right outside of New Bedford. And this was the day that happened. And it picked July 21st because that was the anniversary of her first launch. And this was the enshrinement, they called it. And he opened her to the public. In the next 10 years, over 1 million people came to see the Morgan at Round Hill. And this was before there were big highways. There were trains and trolleys, but they came. And then in 1936, Colonel Greene died, and to everyone's amazement and shock and sorrow, left no money for the ship. And his sister was not interested in her at all. He's another guy that's such a great story. I wish I could tell you more, but fascinating character. Anyway, the ship is there, and they desperately try to find ways to support her. Whaling Enshrined, the organization that he created. But it doesn't work out. And this is the Morgan after the 1938 hurricane, where the coffer dam into which she had been placed and then put in the sand was overcome, and she was banged up a little bit. She got lifted a bit out of the sand. Fortunately, no major structural damage, but they kept trying to raise more money for her, couldn't do it, and some people from the Marine Historical Association in Mystic, Connecticut came and talked to them, and they finally decided in 1941 that they would give her to Mystic. And the way I describe it is they loved the ship so much they gave her away to save her because they tried as hard as they could and they couldn't do it. And that was one of the reasons it was so wonderful to bring her home as a sailing vessel, because they cared enough to give her to Mystic. So here she is coming through the bridge of Mystic on November 8th of 1941, less than 30 days before Pearl Harbor. If she had come after that, she wouldn't have come after Pearl Harbor. So another example of her being a lucky ship. And this out of focus shot is another Nantucket connection. When I got to Mystic, they asked me to look at some pictures, and this is her just after she's come through the bridge. But what I noticed that really nobody else did, I wish this was a little bit clearer, you could see it, but this little flag right here, that little triangular flag, if you could see what was on there, you would see it's a rat. And this is a wharf rat flag. And how it ended up on the Morgan when she came back, I can't tell you, but she did. It did, and you know those flags have been on the moon and the poles, and the Wharf Rat Club is a pretty remarkable place. So Nantucket was part of the ship coming to Mystic. So this is the Cliff Note story of why she was a lucky ship and surviving the 80 years. She was trapped in the Pacific, being driven down onto an island inhabited by hostile natives and no wind. They were ready to board her. They were making lots of noise and were excited about getting the ship and doing bad things to the crew. And at the last second, a current came and snuck them by the island, and they escaped. She was also in a huge storm that voyage. She avoided the Confederate raiders, the Shenandoah and the Alabama, during the Civil War. She was up north when the Shenandoah was sinking so many of the whale ships, but she wasn't caught. She also avoided being part of the Stone Fleet when the federal government bought up 39 whale ships and tried to blockade the ports of Charlestown and Savannah by sinking these ships in the harbor. I like to say there's an old saying, you know, to every complicated problem, there's a simple solution. That doesn't work. And that's what happened here. It didn't work. They sank all these ships. They bought up all these whale ships. People kept their whale ships in port because of these two raiders. It was dangerous for them to go out, so they were able to buy them cheaply, but the concept of sinking them didn't work. Then she avoided being crushed in the ice in 1871 when those 32 other vessels were, including the Emily Morgan, her sister ship, one of the great losses in whaling history. And there was another one, not quite as big, 12 more ships were crushed 4 years later. She managed to get back to New Bedford in spite of World War I, avoiding the shipping lanes and the German submarines. And you saw the fire and Colonel Greene and the hurricane. And so that allowed her to come to Mystic Seaport. And she was there when we came. She was the centerpiece. She really was the magic carpet or the magic magnet that brought people to see Mystic. In the time that she was there before we did this, 20 million people had come to walk on her deck. And she was the centerpiece of the museum. So in 2008, it was decided that she needed to be restored. And so this is her being hauled out at the shipyard. There's a big elevator back here. This is a ship lift. It just goes up and down and capable of obviously lifting the Morgan out. And they've just, by the way, they're working on the Mayflower there now. So here she is coming out of the water. And this is what we were going to work on, this part of the ship, the lower hold. This is where the 90,000 gallons or 2,800 barrels of oil would be kept, and that hadn't been touched. She'd been retopped several times, including by my dad when he first got to Mystic in the 1950s. But that was where we were going to do the work on her. And we used different kinds of wood in the project. Black locust trunnels. I brought some when we're done here. I brought a piece of the original ship. This is a piece of planking from 1841, and I brought some of the original trunnels. They're black locust. This is one. The old timers say that black locust rots about as fast as granite, and we ended up putting 7,000 trunnels into the ship. She's basically fastened with trunnels with some bronze hanger spikes as well. So there's some metal there, but no iron. Iron is what kills ships. So you can see these later if you're interested. And then she was planked, and the frames and knees were oak, white oak, and live oak. I'll show you some of that. Longleaf yellow pine for planking, white pine and Douglas firs for spars, cedar for whaleboat planking, and ash and spruce for the whaleboat oars. This is Quentin Snedeker, who is the head of the shipyard at Mystic, and this is right after we've hauled her out, and he's standing in the lower hold looking at what kind of a mess have we got ourselves into. This is where the work is going to be. You can see we've already tried to start doing some documentation, but I often wondered what Quentin was really saying in his mind right there. He's a marvelous guy. He's a captain, licensed captain, and an amazing shipwright and a manager. So what we're doing here, what you see all along here is called sealing, and that's the inside planking. It's not over the top, it's along the hull. When we then took the sealing off, we exposed the frames of the ship, or the futtocks, and this is the magic part. This is what I really wanted to tell you about, because I got to be there. No one had seen this since the winter of 1841. It had not been seen. This is the original ship, the original wood, the original futtocks, and when we saw this, we knew we had to stop and document everything, because no one would ever see this again. And so that's what we started doing. There was an article in the New York Times about the fact that we tried to use modern techniques too. We got lasers. The surveyors in the audience will understand that you can use lasers to do measurements. And so we did that and had fully documented every precise picture of what she looked like when we took that planking off. And this is a piece of what the laser looks like when they actually present it. So here we are. We're looking along the starboard side aft. That's the stern back there, and you can see we've taken this off. And those again are the original frames, or futtocks as they're called. And you think about it. The guys who did this in 1841, they built her in 8 months, by the way, starting in the winter. They could never have imagined that the ship would still be alive in 2008, let alone that we're now looking at her work. And the cool thing about it is the shipwrights who worked on this project were so impressed by the quality of the work that had been done. They found things that the guys who did them would never think anybody would see that they had done to try to do the best they could. The other thing that this project did was, and you'll see some of the pictures later, we hired a big crew, and we ended up with some young interns and younger people. And one of the great outcomes of a project like this is that you help to train a new generation of large timber shipwrights. And we had some great men and women who were part of it. And these old timers, well, none of them, again, were as old as me, but these older fellows and women who taught them, it was magic to see what they did. So here we go. This is looking along the port side from the stern forward. And you can see we've now taken everything off, and we've got every station was marked, and that's when we did the lasers. That's how we would know where we were, and we really did. We not only marked the frames, we marked where the trunnels were. We marked where the fasteners were. So we documented everything that was there. And this is some of the wood that we use. This is live oak. And live oak comes from the south, from Georgia, the Georgia coast, some of it from Texas as well. You may, if you think of pictures of the old plantations, they're the big trees. Whoops, come back. Did the wrong thing there. This is a trunk over here of a live oak. So what we really were interested in is the branches, because they have natural bends in them, and that's what we were trying to find for the ship. And this is what we call the Miracle of Boston. This is at Yard's End in the Charlestown Navy Yard in Boston. It was the very end of the giant Navy Yard that was there, where the Constitution still is, by the way. When they were excavating to build the new Spalding Rehab Hospital that Partners Healthcare built, they came across this wood. They thought at first it was a wharf or something. But one of the guys who was in the excavation company had worked in a shipyard. He said, wait a minute, that's not just a wharf. And what turns out, what they had uncovered was something called a wood basin. And the wood basin had been created in the late 1800s to store wood that had been purchased by the Navy to be used on large wooden ships like the Constitution. And it had been brought up there, it had been rough cut, it had been purchased by the Navy who had the money to buy the best wood, picked by people who were lifelong shipwrights who knew the best wood. And when they brought it up to Boston, each one of these pieces of wood has a hand-stamped inventory number in the end of it. And they put them in a timber basin, filled it with salt water from the Mystic River, not the Mystic River in Connecticut, but the Mystic River in Boston. And that's how they preserve the wood. Fresh water is the enemy of wood. Salt water is a preservative. And so one of the big fights you have is to keep salt water off your wooden boat, and particularly in the frames and inside. Well, in 1910, the Navy didn't have any wooden ships that they cared about anymore, so they just covered up the timber basin and forgot about it. And nobody remembered it was there until Spalding was built. Partners Healthcare and Walsh Brothers Construction, who were doing the job, called us up, and they gave us 17 truckloads of this wood. And it was absolutely the best wood that we had, and we needed it. We thought we had nowhere near enough live oak, and we got it from them. It was their gift, and we have a great relationship with Spalding Hospital at Mystic Seaport, where we talked about one of the things that brings us together is this coincidence, but isn't it interesting that we were both involved in restorative kind of work, and this we were brought together by this amazing magical moment. So this is back at Mystic at the shipyard. This is what I called a field of futtocks. And my wife says I like alliteration too much, but that's what it is. And we've cut up some of this wood to make the frames for the ship. And this piece here is called the keelson. It's the backbone on the inside of the ship. The outside is the keel, on the inside is the keelson. And it lays on top of the futtocks and is fastened through to the keel. Almost all of that was good, but we needed to replace about 17 feet of it. And this is Jeff Gold, one of the shipwrights, and this is his piece that he's made to replace it. And here it is getting ready to go, and at the same time, one of his colleagues is building a new floor timber out of live oak. So he's got a pattern here of what the shape has to be, and then he's taking this giant piece of live oak and he's fashioning it into this, which is now being placed into the Morgan. That weighed about 2,000 pounds, by the way, that one piece of wood. And here we are placing it in the ship. And there's the scarf in the keelson there too. This is all up in the bow, by the way. So here we are, fast forwarding. Now we're back in the very stern of the ship, looking forward, and everything that you see here that looks light is new. Anything that's dark is original wood. We tested every piece of this, and the wood that we felt was strong enough to stay, we kept. And so about 13% of the ship's lower futtocks are original. And that's partially because they were in salt water and protected in that way, but they were definitely strong enough. And at this point, by the way, a fellow named Steve White came over. Doug Thiessen, who was the president of Mystic, retired, and a guy named Steve White, who had been the head of a school outside of Boston, a sailor from Camden, Maine, had done transatlantic sailing and then got into education, was hired to be the new president. And so we were fully into this restoration of the ship. And he claims that, I'm the first one he said this to, and I certainly remember when he said it, but he called me into his office one day and he said, Matthew, what do you think about if we're doing this and this ship is going to be as strong almost as when she was built, why wouldn't we sail her? If not now, when? And if not now, why? Well, as part of my checkered background, I have to tell you, I did have the good luck to work on a couple of sailing vessels. The topsail schooner Shenandoah I worked on for 5 summers and was the mate. And then Martha and I had the good luck to own a 50-foot schooner called the Maya for 14 years and sailed to Nantucket many times on her. It had never occurred to me to sail the Morgan. How could I, I can't believe I didn't think of that. Steve said he still remembers the expression on my face, which was shock. But we talked about it. I remember coming home that weekend to the vineyard and seeing Martha, and the kids were there, my 2 kids. And I told them, we're thinking about this. What do you think? And my daughter, Kate, said, they've all had to listen to me, forever, so it's not their fault. Most of them have gotten counseling and they're okay now. But Kate said to me, Dad, just think if you did sail her back to New Bedford, there'll be a ghost fleet of 2,700 ships behind her. And so keep that image in mind, because I'll show you something later that'll remind you of it. But that's what, so we thought about it. We made a presentation to the board of directors. They agreed that we could and should. And so the whole focus changed to making it come alive again. And so that's what we're doing. Here you're looking at the new wood. We're looking back at on the port side, looking aft at the stern. And I love this shot because, first of all, you can see how strong this is. These are futtocks. They're always put together in pairs, and they overlap, so there's not a weak spot. See how there's a line there where two futtocks come together, but the one next to it that's attached to it doesn't have that? It's a way to keep the hull strengthened. And the stern of the ship comes together. It's called the run, and it really has an impact on how well the vessel sails. And the run on this ship is absolutely beautiful if you look at it. If you look carefully, you'll see that the curve in the stern changes from this way, then it straightens out, and then it reverses itself. And it's absolutely beautiful to look at. Again, nobody can see this anymore. You'll see in a minute. But that gives you a sense of why people said the whale ships couldn't sail. Well, they can't sail like a 12-meter or a Volvo ocean racer, that's for sure. But this ship sailed to every ocean of the world in 37 voyages, had to get around Cape Horn numbers of times. And so the captain, Kip Files, who sailed her for us, when we did sail her, he said, you know, she did everything we asked her to. She was handy and maneuverable and responsive. So that's what that area looks like. I liked it so much. This is actually a cell phone shot I took from sitting back there in the very end. And again, look at that beautiful curve and that beautiful wood, too. Remarkable stuff. So now we're putting the ceiling back on. And this is yellow pine. And you can see how long it is. Excuse me, this is oak. But we do have a big piece of long leaf yellow pine in the clamp up here. That was a giant piece of wood. It was about 6 inches thick. And that's a really important structural member along the top of the lower hold. There's Jeff Gold looking at all the work they've been doing. This is a guy named John Day who's putting in new knees. We replaced some knees, and you'll see more of that in a second. These are the new knees. This knee is this one right here. This one came from wood from Charlestown. It had a patina to it that was different than the other ones. And this slide appears again somewhere by accident. But anyway, this is looking forward. This is the bow of the ship. These were not original. These structural pieces were not original. They were put in the 1880s when she was going north. They're called ice pointers, and they were designed to protect the hull against ice. And they're massive, as you can see. Those have been replaced in the 1980s, so we didn't do that. But here's the hole, totally empty, totally, and here's that knee from the Charlestown Navy Yard right there, and here's some of the others. So she's now back together. These were stanchions that we replaced. This was an original stanchion that we kept. When the ship was loaded and they put all the casts in here, there were boards that could be put in between these stanchions to hold things in place. Here's the keelson we talked about earlier. And I should have mentioned this earlier. These are like railroad rails that we put underneath the overhead structure to carry all the heavy wood back and forth on chain hoists so that we could move it in and out. So that was just there for the trip. And so here we are again looking back aft with all the new ceiling in. And no one hopefully will see those frames and futtocks again for a long, long time. But we had the unbelievable pleasure and honor and responsibility to do that work. And as you can see, back aft here, we kept more of the original stanchions. We saw that already. This is the mast step for the mainmast. It goes thwart ships, and the mast is dropped in, and it has a little pinion in the bottom that goes in that. And then the mast is held to the ship by the standing rigging, which holds it down. So it's not held in by what's sticking in the keelson. It's really those shrouds that hold it to the ship. This piece of wood, this is called a transom log. This is the stern of the ship. These are the structures that support the end of the transom. These are live oak as well. This piece of wood was one of the pieces that came from Charlestown. It started out 40 feet long and 20 inches square because it had been squared. And Walter Ansell, the shipwright who did this work, counted 300 rings in the 20 squared part, not even the whole tree. This ended up being 23 feet long, and it ties the sides of the ship together, the stern. So it's a really important structural piece. We had some dendrochronologists come from the University of Arizona. I know we always use the term dendrochronologist at breakfast. I mean, it's something we all talk about. It turns out that they're experts who can look at pieces of wood, and because of the databases that they have, the technology, they were able to tell you, make a judgment about where it came from and when it might have been cut. And they told us that this piece of wood was cut in northern Ohio sometime in the 1860s. And so I had the good luck of showing a lot of people through the ship as we were doing the work. And I used to say to people, I said, well, if you want to touch the 1600s, this tree was growing in the 1600s, and here it is now in this new life that it's got, keeping the ship, making the ship stronger. This is the after cabin of the Morgan. That's the couch that's in the back, or settee that's in the master's cabin. But that piece of wood, look, if you could see the grain, it is absolutely beautiful. It's just no knots. It's tight grain. It was a magnificent piece of wood. Now we're looking at the stem of the ship. We had to replace part of the stem and the apron. We're looking from the bow back aft. And this is February of 2012. We're now finished doing the work on the inside, and we're now putting the exterior planking on. This is called the garboard plank. This is the starboard plank. It goes right against the keel. It's the very bottom plank. And so note that that's February 2012. This is May of 2013. This is called the Shuttle Plank. This wood that we use, the white oak and the longleaf yellow pine, much of it had to bend, and the way you make it bend is you take it into a steam box. And so that's what's happening here. The Shuttle Plank is a really important plank. It's the last one that you put in. It means you've finished the job on the hull. And so it's a very celebratory moment, too. And so here's the crew taking the Shuttle Plank out of the steam box. And here we are carrying it to the ship. And then they had to go up a couple of levels to get to the top part where we were putting it in. And here they are getting ready to attach it right here. And if you can see, they actually this is the crew, they all signed their name on the inside here. And we had a nice celebration after that was done, because that meant the hull was finished. So this is what we did in that period of time. 280 new frames and futtocks, 4 new floor timbers, the 17 feet of keelson, you saw that, the new stem and apron, we rebuilt the transom, we reframed the bow, we put 70 new ceiling planks in and 170 plus hull planks, 10 new knees, 14 new spars. We rebuilt all the blocks for the running rigging. That was done by volunteers in our ship, in the ship yard, in the sail loft. We had the rigging set up. We had 19 new sails made by Nat Wilson up in Booth Bay. He also made the sails. These are canvas sails. He made the sails for the Constitution as well, and he's kind of the go-to guy. He trained on the Coast Guard bark Eagle, and that's where he started sailing. Well, he also worked at the sail loft at Mystic Seaport as a young man. So that was where that all came from. And all of this, and the planking, that's where we put the 7,000 trunnels that hold the planks together. We also, as part of this project, we wanted to have some whaleboats built for the ship. And so we ended up having 10 whaleboats built for us. And tell me how you'd respond if we came up and gave you this offer. It's kind of hard to refuse. We went and talked to these different schools, and some 2 professional, they all were professional, but 2 of them were boatyards, regular boatyards. I'll talk about them in a second. But we said, here's the deal. We'd like to invite you to build a whaleboat for the Charles W. Morgan for her 38th voyage. And if you agree to do it, you have to build it to our specs. We'll tell you exactly what kind of wood to use and how to do it. We have a book that was written at Mystic Seaport on how to build whaleboats. And by the way, the people, Willett Ansel, who wrote that book, came to Nantucket and looked, I think, at this whaleboat. And he wrote it back in the 70s. And it's part of writing it. So you have to build it to our specs under our supervision. And you have to raise $100,000 to build it. And when you're done, you have to give us a boat. I mean, who could turn that down? It's a great opportunity. But we ended up, it worked out great for us in a bunch of ways. It turned out, look at the way they were built. Alexandria Seaport Foundation in Alexandria, Virginia, the apprentice shop in Rockland, Maine, Lowell's Boat Shop in Amesbury, Massachusetts, which is, by the way, the oldest boat building shop in America. It's a National Historic Landmark. And all of these places teach kids, and they use boat building as a way to, the STEM education, learning about math, and also just building. Then the Beetle Boat Shop. The Beetle Shop in New Bedford built more whaleboats than anybody. They actually, once the industry shifted to San Francisco, they had a boat, they built them out there too. But the Beetle boat is the boat. Lake Champlain Maritime Museum in Vermont, the Great Lakes Boat Building School in Cedarville, Michigan, on Great Lake, Michigan. Independent Seaport Museum in Philadelphia built 2. Gannon and Benjamin on the Vineyard built 1. And Rocking the Boat, which is in the Bronx in New York, built 1. And these 2, Lake Champlain and Great Lakes, I spoke at both of the launchings of the boat, and I was able to tell them, to my knowledge, these are the only whaleboats that have ever been launched into fresh water, because they were built, obviously, on the coast. And so it's kind of cool to have them. But this is one of them. This shot was actually taken in New Bedford. And it's with an Azorean whaleboat, which are bigger, longer, they're shore-based, and bigger sails, but beautiful boats. But the Beetle ones the whaleboats are wonderful as well. This is a group of the whaleboats that were built for us. They're gathered, and they're getting ready to celebrate the launch. This is a quick look at the process I just described to you slowly. Here's the Morgan coming out of the water at the shipyard. Here we are looking at it. Well, I'll tell you. That's the bow. It's Walt Ansel right there. Clocking. We built a lot of the hardware for the ship in our blacksmith shop, our shipsmith shop, which came originally from New Bedford, and probably built stuff for the Morgan when she was sailing. New planking being added. Look at how thick that is. We had to bend that. She did need a little work. Those are the trunnels there. She looked like when she first came out. So that was part of the whole process that we went through. And one of the things I'd like to say is that wooden ship restoration is a lot like orthopedic surgery. Everybody likes the outcome, but sometimes you don't want to watch the process. And I had the luck to be able to watch the whole thing, and it was amazing, that whole time. And here we are getting ready to launch her on July 21st of 2013. the same date that she was originally launched. These things are meaningful to some of us, I guess, and fun. One thing that happened this particular day, the crowd is gathered in, you'll see a quote in a minute that tells you a little bit more about it, but the shipyard crew came in early that day. The day turned out to be beautiful, but it was overcast. And they came in early, and they had a little celebration about welcoming her back into the water. She was going to be launched. And they passed around little cups of, I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but there's something called rum that sailors sometimes drink. And so some Mount Gay was passed around. And then Quentin Snedeker took a toggle harpoon without the shaft in it, took that out, poured some rum into the cavity, and then went over and poured it into the water to wish the ship good luck in the future. And this is the stuff you can't make up. And I wasn't there, I was somewhere else, but everyone who was there told me this, and Brenton told me this. As the rum hit the water, there was a spontaneous clap of thunder, a huge clap of thunder. And it was the only clap of thunder that whole day. And then this rain squall came through and then cleared up. But it literally was simultaneous. So, she's a lucky ship, is all I can tell you. And that's what happened. Another Nantucket, this is Sally Bullard, who is the great-great-great-granddaughter of Charles W. Morgan. And so we had her christen the ship. And we filled the bottle that she was using with water that our partners, we had a great partnership with NOAA, and with SEA and other people. We got water from the Atlantic, we got water from the Pacific, we got water from the Indian Ocean, we got water from the Mystic River, we got water from New Bedford Harbor, and we put that into the bottles. We had two of them in case one of them broke on the way out. But this was Sally, and she was pretty serious about making sure this thing worked, as you can tell by looking at her face. Rick Burns, the wonderful filmmaker who actually did the great film that's shown here, said he was our keynote speaker. And this is what he said: what this single ship and this historic moment connects us to, looking back into the depths of our history, looking out into our bonds with the world, looking forward into the future, is nothing short of miraculous. And it was a great, great day. I should mention, by the way, that the co-chair of this entire effort was a guy you may have heard of named Nat Philbrick. And Nat also spoke on this day, and it was a great talk on him. But it was a marvelous day. And now we've got a rigger, and that's what's happening subsequently. Again, she's going to sail in 214. We've got a lot of other work to do. We've got to put systems in, but we're starting to put some of those new spars in. And look how beautiful she looks. She's got her sheer back, and she's painted really well, too. That's important. This is a rigger who is putting the wind vane on the top. And I don't know if I'm thinking that some of you know Don Peacock and the Lynx, and this is his son Alex, who worked with us as a rigger on the Morgan project. And of course, he's been the captain of the Lynx too. So that's Alex literally at the top of the mizzen, topmast, putting that wind thing on. So Nantucket was represented in that way too. And then we finally took her, we put 70 tons of ballast in her in Mystic, but we couldn't put any more in because she couldn't draw more than 10 feet of water in the Mystic River. We took her to New London, finished putting another 70 tons of ballast into her, brought together a crew of about 30 professional sailors, men and women, from all over the country who came to sail her. And then this was the first day she sailed. This was out of New London, where we did our practice sails, if you will, and working the ship. But there she is. This is a fully restored 1900 steam launch yacht that was donated to us for the whole voyage. But look at her. There she is, under sail, and with those beautiful new sails that Nat Wilson made for us up in Booth Bay. And she's at sea again. So now we're going to take her on her 38th voyage, and this is the idea. We received a large grant from the National Endowment for Humanities, and we had these different themes that we were working on as what we were going to do. We wanted to bring the ship to places, and we wanted to bring the story. So we brought a little kind of mini museum with us wherever we went. And we had different demonstrations and people to talk with about skills and what we've been up to. And this is what we were trying to do, to learn, to teach, to inspire, to lead, and to listen, too. We wanted to do that. So here she is leaving the museum, going out through that bridge that she'd come through in 1941, headed out. And this is part of what we brought. We had a 40-foot, believe it or not, whoops, come back here, inflatable whale, sperm whale, and she went with us everywhere. And we had, Noah had a booth, we had our Cooper, we had our shipsmith with us, we had interpreters all over the place. And so we really brought the whole story with us as we traveled. This was in New Bedford. This is a cultural gathering. We had all kinds of special events, one of which was, by the way, a special event for the Nantucket Historical to have a private evening aboard the ship in New Bedford. And you'll see in a minute us coming to New Bedford, but it was great to be there. This is some of the panels that we had ashore. And so we also brought on each of the legs of the trip, we brought 10 voyagers. And they were people who applied. They had to apply, and we picked people who could tell our story. We called it public history. We wanted other people to be aboard and tell us what the experience was like for them. So some of them were scientists, some of them were poets, some of them were artists. It was a great collection of people, and they produced some great products. And so here she is underway, and some shots of her driving through. As I say, Kip Files, who was the captain, was the owner and captain of a vessel called the Victory Chimes up in Maine, 3-masted schooner. He said she handled beautifully. Here's the crew furling sails as they had to in the old days. And one of the places that we went to was to Boston, where we tied up behind the Constitution. And Bill Fowler, who's a wonderful maritime historian, made this comment about the Constitution and the Morgan in the sense that he said both vessels were the product of a young, energetic nation determined to find its place in the world. Wherever they went, they were America to all who saw them. They're both national icons. I have a nice shot of that a little later, you'll see. So here she is coming back, and juxtaposed against the photograph. This is called cockbilling the yard so that you don't hit the bridge, done in both cases. But that was at the end of the voyage. And one of the things that, I have a short film I want to show you of the voyage because there's some things that I can't adequately explain or describe, but I want you to see. But I do want to say, just mention something my dad wrote in that book. It's funny when at one point he received an honorary degree from Yale in 1964, along with people like Martin Luther King and Averell Harriman and Lynn Fontaine and Alan Lunt. And when Kingman Brewster gave him his degree, he said, of Mr. Stackpole, it can be said just that in his case, the whaleship was his Harvard and his Yale College, and that's of course a quote from Moby Dick. But this is how Dad ended the Sea Hunters, and this is what he said: "Today, in a world which has become so closely knit in an air age." Now, remember, he wrote this in the 50s. The limitations of geographical positions are not so apparent as they were even a quarter of a century ago. But the whalemen of the early 19th century gave a conceptualization of internationalism that was far ahead of his time. As a mariner, he was a citizen of the watery world. As a man of industry, he was a worker who added greatly to the material wealth of his country. As an oceanographer, he was a seaman who contributed much to the world's knowledge. As a whaler, he was a sea hunter whose exploits are a vibrant chapter in American history. So that's how he's helping us remember our own story and how we got to where we are. And so what I'm hoping to do with Yeshi's help over here is we're going to just take you aboard the ship as we go on this 38th voyage.
For that moment actually to arrive and to see her released from the dock and to have everybody there to celebrate with us, it was certainly history in the making and a moment I'm sure all of us will remember forever.
A drone shot. Look at the crowds along here. They started singing God Bless America.
She's telling her story. She's telling America's maritime story in these ports that all have some sort of relevance to what she represents. It's our opportunity as a museum to engage people in maritime history in a way that just hasn't been done, quite frankly, with a vessel like the Charles W. Morgan.
Remember the black and white shots from down to the sea. The Morgan flag. This is a small boat being run over by a whaleship. Hey! 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 Throwing off the gaskets, getting ready to set the squaresails. These guys are doing the jib on the jibboom. This is on the way to Newport. The whaleboats have different sheer strengths so that you could tell which boat it was when they saw them from the ship. That's why they all have different colors. The drone shot. This is us coming across Buzzards Bay, coming back to New Bedford. Remember the 2,700 ghost ships behind her. This is what it looked like that day.
That's the way.
Driving along, when she got to Buzzards Bay, she got on the wind, and Kip Plows said to me, guess what? The course is going to take her right to Round Hill. She's going back to where she was. Here we are approaching New Bedford. Port Phoenix. Local whaleboats came out to see us.
History has never felt so alive to me as it was when we came through that hurricane barrier. To see the people, to understand how much they appreciated everything that we've done, and to validate the great history of the city, it just couldn't have been better.
We spent 10 days in New Bedford. 30,000 people came to see the ship. Here we are furling one of the topsails. We're on our way now. The spanker brails in and out. It doesn't hoist up and down. It gets pulled out on the gap. Here she is driving along. Look at that. 7 knots, 8 knots. They couldn't sail though, these boats. Look at her. But we're going to be bracing the yards here. Watch how they all come around together. You can't do them independently. They have to stay together. That's not as easy as it looks. This is Sam, the first mate. He sailed around the world twice on the 15 passengers. Watch this. This is the shin cracker, the tiller. It doesn't, the wheel moves, it's a big tiller. The Hillmans are the only other people I've ever known who have one of those.
Keep going.
Look at that. That's beautifully set. Now she's got everything up. No, she doesn't have the 4 courses. There is everything up. Look at the man in the hoops. That gives you scale. This is Kip Plows, the captain. Here we are hoisting one of the vessels. We made all of those iron rings that you see, the hanks. The little boat in the background is the Mystic Whaler, by the way. Kind of ironic. Here we are at Stellwagen Bank with our partners from NOAA. Guess what? Amazing. Look at the ship, full sail, and there they are. Put the whaleboats over. Watch this. That's Nat Philbrick to the left and Sylvia Earle to the right, the famous oceanographer.
Oh, look at that. Oh, look at. I'd say that.
Look at this. Right under the ship.
There's one to the left. Look at that guy. Wow.
The woman to the right is the head of the Melville Society. This whale is feeding. It's a baleen whale. It's a right whale.
There she goes. There she blows.
Wow. Wouldn't mind we were there. Full sail again. Man in the hoops. Here we are leaving Provincetown. That's the Pilgrims Monument. Kind of a hazy day. We're on our way to Boston. When we get to Boston, you'll see the skyline in the background. And at one point, as we come in, you'll see a sign that says the Charlestown Navy Yard. And very quickly there, you'll see the Bunker Hill Monument and the Constitution and the Morgan all together. This is a crew that was brought together by Jacques Cousteau's son, who's an oceanographer himself. This is the outer harbor in Boston. Prudential Center. The Red Sox had a game in our honor, by the way, while we were there. They literally went along with us and called it a whale of a game. They really did that. Kip got to throw out the first pitch. Here's the Charlestown Navy Yard. There's the Constitution. There's the Bunker Hill Monument. And here we are, the oldest American naval ship and the oldest American merchant ship afloat. We're getting towed through the Cape Cod Canal. Tisbury Towing, which helps to deliver airplane fuel and fuel to the Nantucket, donated 2 tugs for the entire 6 weeks. We couldn't have done it without them. The canal looks beautiful, doesn't it? Here we are, everything up. We're coming back to Mystic. This is the Mystic schooner, Brilliant, that comes down for the Opera House race. Sparkman and Stevens schooner. We're not sure she really wanted to come back.
All right, let's cast off all the bow line and stern line.
Here we are leaving New London to go back into the Mystic River. That's Brian Dennehy, the famous actor. That's New London Lighthouse. Now we're entering the Mystic River. That's Morgan Point, although there's no connection. One of our deckhands, wonderful woman from Maine. That's the official number of the schooner, of the ship. Now we're coming through the railroad bridge. Again, crowds all along the river. Here we are approaching the bridge. It's very tight here, by the way. I was right there on the port side. I could reach out and touch it. Here's the whaleboats. Coming around the point, that's the replica of Graham Point Lighthouse that my dad was part of creating. Here we are coming back to the wharf. There's the Seaport Street at Mystic. So that's a little bit of the story of the Charles W. Morgan history, restoration, and 38th voyage. And thank you for giving me a chance to do that. It's been really wonderful. As you can, I mean, it means a lot to me to be able to be here. It's really a kick for me. So thank you for the chance to do that. I did give one other talk here when we were in the middle of all this, but it's so much more fun to tell the whole story. Any quick questions before I have one other thing I want to do here? How long is it? She is 105 feet on deck, 158 overall. So if you tie up it to a wharf, they charge you for the 158 because of the jib. Look at the big head rig in her. You know, and there was a story when she was in the Pacific about being caught in a hurricane. The wind caught her from behind, and that jib boom went into the water. She was lifted up so much, but she came back and survived. But yeah, that's how. And 13,000 square feet of sail. No, we just said we did put some pumps on and generators for the electronics. We put modern navigational electronics, but that's all. We didn't put an engine in, but we had the tugboats. Yeah. Yes. Well, at this point, 13% of it is the original boat, which is, you know, we saved everything we could. One of the great things about a wooden boat, and I've had a wooden boat, is that they're infinitely renewable. And if you're doing it right, you do that. She was retopped from the waterline up for the first time in the 1880s, having, 40 years after she was built. And that's when she was at sea. I mean, the best thing for a vessel is to be used and to be out in the wind and have the salt water on her. And then she was retopped at Mystic in the 50s and then again in the 80s. But nothing had been touched below from the deck level down to the lower hold. So, and we were amazed that those lower futtocks were strong enough. I mean, we had to make sure she was safe enough to sail, and they were. So that made us happy that she could still have that part of her. Yeah. Else? James. It is, yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting because what they did when the ships went to the Pacific, they put sheathing on the outside of them, and then they put copper on the outside of that too. They put a kind of a felt, and then they put the sheathing on, which was pine, and the idea was if any boring organism got through the copper, it would get into the pine, and guess what? We don't know why, but these things don't keep boring straight. They turn and go with the grain. So they didn't bother the planking at all. They just went along that way. But again, that big piece of of wood that was the keel is deepest in the water, and I'm sure that she ran aground somewhere at some point, but that didn't. They say there are two kinds of sailors: those that have run aground and those that are liars. So I'm sure that she did. But it is amazing that that piece of wood was in such great shape. It really was. And that's the backbone. Well, I'm happy to hang around and talk to you. I want to show you, come up and take a look at this, but I have I've been deputized by Steve White, the president of Mystic Seaport, to make a presentation to Mr. Russell, who, when we were doing this project, we all got to know each other pretty well, and James at New Bedford and Steve and Mystic and Bill Tramposh spent a lot of time together. In fact, they started calling themselves the Three Amigos. I heard them do this in public, so I know that. And we had this great event at New Bedford, where the Nantucket Historical came over. But what James did in New Bedford in terms of welcoming us, he not only did welcome to us, but he spent 2 years bringing together every organization in town, all the cultural organizations, the amazing array of folks, and they all worked together with the mayor's office, and it was such a celebratory thing. It was really, really unbelievable how much fun. We had so much fun, and the joy that people had there was really cool. So, as part of the Morgan Project, we had donated to us 100 ties that were made just for us to give to major donors. But Steve White asked me to, on behalf of Mystic Seaport, to present one to James as a thank you, really, for all that he did. So, James, if you'll come up. There you go. Now, you don't have to wear it all the time, I mean, really. We'd like you to have one, though. So, yeah. I will definitely do that. So, thank you again so much for coming. Come on up if you want to talk. Definitely come up and touch a piece of the original ship. And again, thanks so much for your warm welcome. Great to be here.